Welcome to part two of colonial society. Now we're going to take a look at colonial economies and communities. Now, if we're really going to take a very detailed look at the communities and economies of these colonies, we would need to break them down into 13 different discussions, but we're not going to do that here. We'll take a look at it in two macro levels, the North and the South. And the reason why we're going to do that is that ultimately the North and the South is also going to be the main dividing line that's going to lead to the Civil War, and there are macro similarities between the groups, even if you go, like, say, from Pennsylvania to New York, right? Northern farms tend to be either subsistence farms or market-oriented farms, right? They're not doing large-scale farming, and there's a reason for this, right? You're feeding your family, you're taking some minor stuff to the local market because your growing cycle's short, right? Further north there, the land is not as conducive to farming, the growing cycle's shorter, so there's a lot of reasons not to do large-scale farming, right? In southern farms, well, you got land that is more conducive to large-scale farming, you got a longer growing cycle, and you got better land for farming, and so you get commercial-oriented farming developed, right? Commercial-oriented farming is large-scale crops. This isn't just for feeding your family or taking to the local market. This is stuff you're going to sell out or maybe even export overseas. Things like tobacco, indigo, rice, and then ultimately, of course, cotton. Eventually, cotton will dominate the South. And in fact, cotton will finally reach a point of dominance to where the Southern economy is going to be a one-trick pony. It's going to be cotton farming. It's going to be the entire Southern economy. This, of course, also lends itself to slave labor, because with these large commercial-oriented farms, you have a lot of need for labor. You need a massive workforce for that. And when indentured servitude disappears, slavery is used to fill that gap. The North isn't as conducive to slavery because it's not as useful in these smaller market-oriented or subsistence oriented farms. So the result of this is that the North is going to be far more industrial, right? You got to do something else then, right? While the South becomes mostly an agricultural society, the North is going to be rather diversified, right? They're going to have all kinds of different industries, things like textile mills, grain mills, things like that. They have a lot of fast-flowing rivers that they can use to help aid that process. There's going to be iron works up there. There is supplies of iron ore up there that's readily accessible, and also coal once you start developing the coking process. And shipbuilding. Shipbuilding is going to be huge in the North, right? Because you have a bunch of large forests and stuff, and so again, a lot of things that are very conducive to building ships, right? In the South, you're not going to have as much of this because everything's going to be so reliant on agriculture. In fact, by the time the Civil War starts, the industrial output of the entire South is equal to 1/4 of the industrial output of just the state of New York. In the South, there's only going to be one major iron foundry called Tredegar Iron Works outside of Richmond. In the South, there's only going to be one large gunpowder manufacturing factory outside of Augusta, Georgia. These are some disadvantages when the Civil War comes around, that's going to be pretty profound. When we look at the colonial governments, they're all over the map, right? I mean, think about it. It's part of this different times, different reasons for starting the colonies, but think about some of the stuff we've already talked about, right? You had things like the religious colonies of New England. You know, Massachusetts Bay Colony is run by the church. It's a congregational colony. You have sole proprietorships like William Penn in Pennsylvania and Cecilius Calver in Maryland. You have limited oligarchies like what you had in Carolina and those trustees in Georgia. So there's not a lot of similarity in these governments, and there's not a big effort by the British to have them form similar governments. You don't see this in places like Spain and France as far as their colonies in the Americas, right? They appoint a royal governor who answers directly to the king, right? Or a viceroy or whatever you want to call him. Okay, the British don't do this. They operate under a policy of what's called benign neglect, right? As long as these raw materials keep coming to Britain to go into British factories and make finished goods, which then could be sold back to our colonies, you govern yourselves however you want, right? Now, we can say this, though, by the time that the American Revolution starts, there are some general similarities. By that point, every single English colony has a royal governor appointed by the king. Some of them, it's been that way for a long time. Others, it's kind of had been thrusted upon them by that point. All of them, by this point, have some form of colonial legislatures, right? Whether it's something that developed out of William Penn's assembly that he created, or Cecilius Calvert's assembly as well, or what have you. You now have assemblies like what you had in Virginia with the House of Burgesses, and they predominantly want to try and trade in specie. Specie just means hard coin, currency, gold, silver, things like that. But it's very difficult for them to do. Every one of these colonies will have paper money that they print. But there's a lot of problems with that from the word go. Because these colonies do see themselves as very different from each other, typically, if you like, say, for example, Rhode Island dollars are not good in Connecticut, right? Or there's ridiculous exchange rates. So you want things exchanged in specie as much as possible. And that's going to be one of the continual problems, because eventually when the taxation policy of the British government start causing some of the angst amongst the colonists, one of the issues is going to be is that the British government expected to receive tax money in specie. Colonial life varied drastically depending on which colony you were in. So again, I'm going to kind of broad brush this, but the one thing that we can say is both north and south, you did have cities. More of them, of course, were in the north. You had more populated cities in the north, cities like New York and Philadelphia that by the American Revolution will have eclipsed 25,000 residents. In the south, though, you had some cities too. Charlestown in South Carolina, for example, had 12,000 residents at the start of the American Revolution, right? These cities, both north and south, served as major trade hubs. So most of them, of course, were on the coast. They were major port cities and things like that. In the countryside, you had variations. In the south, though, you had a lot of plantation societies, right? You had these large plantations that would develop that would have these slave populations work in the fields, and then you had small towns that would pop up near them that would provide the essential services for the plantations in the region. In the north, well, looking at just New England anyways, you had Puritan-style communities, and you see this predominantly in the north, where you have communities where you have a commons, an open area that belongs to the public. That's also where the church will be, because this life in society centers around the church, right? Everything else grows around it. The town grows around the church, and then the farms spread out from there, because the church is the central focal point of life. You know, after you're born, you're baptized in the church. When you get married in the church. When you die, you get buried behind the church.